It was a harsh word by a professor that left the world talking when another voice surfaced unexpectedly. Energy buzzed in the lecture hall as students filled it, though some had their notebooks clutched while the others balanced coffee cups. It was just another Tuesday in Whitmore University, one of the most prestigious, situated in the heart of Oregon. Inside room 302, a class on cultural criticism was soon to start. The teacher would be Professor Eleanor Grayson, a name that inspired both awe and controversy. Known for fearless critiques and no-holds-barred opinions, Grayson was a maverick, pushing boundaries by citing public figures in her critiques to dissect the normalcy of society. She sat in the third row with the rest, lost in a sea of expectant faces, a young man few would recognize. Tall, poised, but quiet in a way that didn't reveal anything about the observation he made was Baron Trump, sitting there unobserved. He was wearing a plain hoodie and jeans, keeping his head slightly down as if he didn't want to draw attention. His presence was no coincidence. Baron had enrolled in the university under an assumed name, hoping for anonymity. Despite his family's prestige, he wanted an ordinary life, one where he could think without the shadow of his last name looming over him. As the students settled in their seats, Professor Grayson walked to the podium, commanding the room almost instantly with her presence. "Good morning, everyone," she started, speaking crisply and confidently. "Today we're diving into the concept of public image, how it's constructed, manipulated, and sometimes weaponized. And we'll be using some real-life examples." Baron shifted in his seat, his expression neutral. He wasn't sure what to expect but could already feel the weight of the moment. What followed would shake the room, and him, in ways no one could have predicted. Professor Grayson wasn't just a lecturer, she was a force of nature. A doctorate from Stanford and a prodigious career in cultural analysis had built her a reputation for fearlessly taking on societal hypocrisy. Lectures were always going viral, brilliant critique and polarizing rant, but mostly brilliant critique, and her classes were packed by students looking forward to the intellectual fireworks promised by her presence. Today was no exception. As Grayson began, she wove through examples of influential figures, analyzing dexterously the contrast between their public personas and the realities lurking beneath. She was captivating, her words sharp and deliberate. Yet it wasn't long before her tone shifted, and she introduced a name that caught Baron's attention instantly. "Take Melania Trump, for instance," she said, pacing the stage with the confidence of someone completely in command. "A woman revered for her beauty and reserve. But what does that tell us about our standards? Are we so superficial that beauty and quiet are qualities that deserve praise?" A buzz circulated through the class. Some people nodded, others exchanged guarded glances. Baron felt a faint constriction in his chest, but his expression remained impassive. Grayson's voice continued on, now heavy with irony. "What about intelligence, contribution, influence through substance rather than surface? Is this really the image we want to hold up for young women today?" Baron stared at the desk in front of him, his mind racing. He had attended the lecture out of genuine curiosity about the world of academia and intellectual discourse. But now he felt a sense of unease creeping in, not because he disagreed entirely with the concept but because of how personal it felt. His classmates seemed entranced, some even chuckling at Grayson's quips. She had a way of making her words feel like gospel, and the room leaned into her critique. But for Baron this wasn't just a lesson, it was a challenge. A boundary had been crossed and he wasn't sure if he could let it go. Grayson didn't stop there. She circled back to Melania Trump, dissecting her every move from the words she used during public speeches to that her infamous jacket reading, "I really don't care, do you?" The students leaned in, awestruck by her sharp commentary. "She's a symbol," Grayson declared, stretching her arms out for emphasis. "But a symbol of what? Of a bygone era when women were expected to stand silently behind powerful men, to smile prettily and say nothing of substance?" A few students tittered in response. Some murmured, "Righteous?" The mood in the classroom began to swell with tension as Grayson seemed to lean heavier into her criticism. "It's amazing," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "how quickly we confuse quietness with grace and obedience with class. What are we teaching the next generation?" Baron's fists clenched beneath the desk. The professor wasn't just attacking a public figure, she was attacking his mother. For years he had sat by and watched Melania endure judgment and ridicule. People saw only her image, her past as a model, or her accent, and that was fodder for their assumptions. For him, though, she was more, the fiercely private, intelligent woman who quietly protected her family. Grayson's words sounded like an attack, not only on his mother but on the values she embodied. "What if," she continued, dripping sarcasm into every word, We honored women who made a difference and not just those who could afford designer gowns? The class laughed now, and Barron felt a sharp stab in his chest. He looked around at his classmates' faces. Some of them were entertained, others indifferent, but none seemed to raise a question about the one-sided argument. And yet he said nothing, for the time being. He didn't know if it was fear, respect for the professor, or the weight of being in an environment where his family name was probably unwelcome. But deep down, a spark of resolve began to burn. Grayson didn't stop there, and as her words grew harsher, so did Barron's determination to speak up. "Let's not forget the irony," she said, turning toward the class with a faint smirk. "A woman whose public statements are few but contain nuggets like, 'Be best,' or as the Associated Press has transmuted it, 'Be best.' A motto so syntactically clunky that you can't help wondering, lack of knowledge or lack of vetting?" The class burst out again, this time louder. Barron's face flushed. His heart hammered inside his chest. It wasn't anger, it was something far richer. Disappointment, frustration, the realization that for all her intelligence, Professor Grayson was using her platform to humiliate someone who wasn't there to defend themselves. His mind raced through the lessons his parents had drilled into him: always stay composed, never escalate, and let actions speak louder than words. But this wasn't a moment for silence. For years Barron had stayed out of the spotlight, letting his family shoulder the public's opinions, critiques, and sometimes outright hostility. Yet now, sitting in that room, he felt a responsibility not just to his mother but to the concept of fairness itself. He took a deep breath, his hand steadying on the desk. Slowly he raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, it was calm, deliberate, almost as if time itself had slowed down. The professor paused mid-sentence, her gaze narrowing as she spotted him. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped as though annoyed by the interruption. Barron stood, his movements graceful but firm. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes turning toward him. The laughter had evaporated, replaced by a palpable curiosity. No one recognized him yet, but his commanding presence seemed to demand attention. "I think you're missing something important," he said, his voice steady, each word clear and deliberate. There was no anger in his tone, no defensive edge, just a quiet confidence that made everyone lean in a little closer. But as his words began to flow, it became clear that Barron Trump wasn't just defending his mother, he was redefining the entire conversation. Barron's voice carried through the room, steady but unyielding. "You talk about my mother as if she's just an image, a caricature of what society wants her to be, but have you ever stopped to consider the humanity behind the headlines?" The professor blinked. Caught off guard by the interruption, a few students exchanged glances, unsure of where this was going. Still Barron pressed on, his tone measured but firm. "My mother grew up in a small town in Slovenia, in a family that didn't have much. She worked hard to make something of herself, navigating a world where people judged her for everything: her accent, her looks, her past, and yet she succeeded. She became a model, learned 5 languages, and eventually became the First Lady of the United States, not because she sought fame or power, but because she believed in her family and her values." A murmur rippled through the room. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others leaned forward, drawn in by the unexpected depth of his words. Barron's voice never wavered, his gaze locked on Professor Grayson. "You say she represents outdated ideals, but maybe the problem isn't her, maybe it's how we as a society decide what's worth celebrating. You criticize her for being quiet, but isn't there strength in choosing your words carefully and speaking only when you have something meaningful to say?" The room was utterly silent now, the weight of his words settling over the students like a heavy blanket. Even Grayson, known for her quick rebuttal, seemed momentarily stunned. "And let's not pretend," Barron continued, "that public figures like my mother don't pay a price for everything they do. Every smile, every gesture, every mistake is dissected, mocked, and judged by people who've never walked a day in their shoes. We're quick to tear people down but slow to consider the cost of living under that microscope." He paused, letting the room absorb his words. For the first time the students saw not just a classmate but someone who carried the weight of experiences they could barely comprehend. But Barron wasn't finished yet. What came next would challenge not just the professor but everyone in the room to think differently. For a moment the room felt suspended in time, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Then a faint shuffle of papers broke the silence, followed by the soft hum of whispered reactions. Some students sat frozen, their eyes wide with surprise, while others exchanged glances that ranged from impressed to uneasy. Barron's words had cut through the noise in a way no one had anticipated. Professor Grayson, typically quick to retake control, hesitated. Her confident demeanor faltered for just a second before she composed herself. "Those are compelling points," she said, her tone measured but tinged with defensiveness. "But isn't it fair to scrutinize public figures, especially when they occupy roles that influence millions?" Barron nodded, his expression calm. "It's fair to scrutinize actions, but what you're doing isn't scrutiny, it's mockery. It's easy to judge someone based on what you see from the outside, but it's harder to understand their full story. What if we shifted the conversation to the values behind the image instead of tearing down the person?" The professor opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. A few students started clapping, a tentative sound at first, then growing louder one by one. Others joined in until the room was filled with applause. The sound was more than just approval, it was a release of tension and acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just happened. A student in the back raised his hand. I never thought about it like that, he admitted. Maybe we are too quick to judge people we don't know. Another chimed in, yeah, it's easy to point fingers, but we forget that public figures are still human beings. The ripple effect of Barron's words was undeniable. Grayson, now standing silent at the podium, glanced around the room. It was clear that the dynamic had shifted. What began as her lecture had turned into a conversation, a real raw exchange of ideas that she hadn't entirely anticipated. Barron sat down quietly, his presence no longer anonymous. He didn't smile or revel in the attention. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost pensive as the applause died down. But this moment wasn't just about applause, it was about the lasting impression Barron's response would leave on everyone in the room. The lecture ended, but the energy in the room lingered like an aftershock. Students gathered their belongings, slowly whispering to each other as they replayed the exchange in their minds. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone challenge Professor Grayson in a way that didn't feel combative, but instead transformative. Barron quietly packed his bag, keeping his head down. A few students approached him hesitantly. Hey, that was brave, one of them said, her voice tinged with admiration. You really made me think differently about things. He smiled faintly, nodding in acknowledgement. He didn't say much. He wasn't there to bask in praise. His goal wasn't to win an argument, it was to shift the conversation, and judging by the hushed discussions around him, he had succeeded. Meanwhile, Professor Grayson remained at the podium, flipping through her notes as if searching for something to ground her. A few students approached her with questions, but even she seemed less sure-footed than usual. As she walked out of the lecture hall, her expression was one of contemplation rather than triumph. The impact of the moment didn't stop at the classroom doors. Later that day, snippets of the exchange began circulating on social media. A student had recorded part of Barron's response and shared it online with the caption, "When the quietest person in the room changes everything." Within hours, the clip gained traction, sparking debates in comment sections about respect, public perception, and the power of standing up for what you believe in. Across campus, students debated what had happened. Was Grayson out of line? Was Barron right to speak up? For the first time in a while, the focus wasn't on gossip or superficial matters, it was on meaningful dialogue about values, judgment, and humanity. Professor Grayson, known for her stubbornness, found herself replaying Barron's words in her mind long after the lecture had ended. That evening, as she prepared for her next class, she paused, staring at her notes. That as much as she criticized public figures, something about her usual demeanor felt somewhat off now, even hollow, Uchendu claimed. She came to the realization that compassion is not a sign of weakness, but a force to be reckoned with. However, this is just the start. The events of the prerequisite led to Taijima's moment of epiphany, which began to have effects outside the walls of the university. The buzz around campus became evident with whispers about the events of last week, but this time there was energy in the air. The students arrived earlier to get themselves settled into their seats. It was only a week ago that the university started off this entire exchange, so people were still deeply fixated around the events of the past. Professor Grayson had claimed that the past week was coined over a saga of great events, and Alvarado intended on uncovering its true meaning. Grayson stated with a certain amount of reflection that, "This past week was nameless for me, but I must say, I was quite literally challenged in a way to reconsider not only my arguments but my teaching methods, and part of that is my gratitude to all of you," she said as Barron caught a sneak glance, and the ambassador sat with his quashing silence, shrouding Taijima as an ever-reliable force. "I believe," she mentioned, "not only has Taijima set a great example for herself and the people around her, but she has also empowered countless more." Grayson remarked, "Yes, precisely. I'd like to say from an international relations standpoint, sociology is also somewhat important, and Taijima is rightfully revered as a stellar example for all AGSU students. I am truly sorry as I failed to extend that empathy relating to a certain piece of feedback that was given as a critique. In such circumstances, Barron addressed me in his usual tone, and he was kind enough to appreciate my endeavors.